The test is in 4-part, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4. Now look at Part 1.
Part 1.
You will hear a radio announcer giving details of the evening's broadcast programmes. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
The time is 6:55 on Thursday, October the 15th. And now here is a brief review of this evening's programmes on Radio 6. Starting in just a few minutes, at 7 o'clock, we have the first programme in our new series, Animal Talk, a documentary with Laura Martins and Jeff Burns. And I'll be telling you some more about that in a minute. Then at 7:50 there will be a broadcast on behalf of the Rare Species Protection Group, telling you about some of the work they're doing to preserve endangered species. This will be followed at 8 o'clock by today's episode of Park Square, our drama series following the fortunes of a close-knit community in North London, in which Sunita begins to wonder if Carl has been telling her the truth, and Carl gets into trouble when a private email is read by the wrong person. At 8:30 we have our phone-in programme, What's Your View? Today's topic is the impact of the media, and you are invited to call in with your own views and questions on this topic. If you have a question for the panel, the number to call is 0207 815 4222. This will be followed at 9 o'clock by news and weather, and then at the new time of 9:20 we have our Book of the Week, read by Graham Stanish. This week's book is a collection of Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, which the author wrote for his children at the beginning of the 20th century, and which are now enjoyed by children and adults alike. This evening's story, entitled How the First Letter Was Written, is an imaginary account of the events that led to the invention of writing, involving a young girl called Taffy, and a series of misunderstandings that arise when Taffy sends the first written message in the history of the world.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
And now, some more information about our major new documentary series, Animal Talk, which explores the fascinating area of animal communication. Tonight's programme compares the communication systems used by two of the world's largest creatures, the killer whale and the elephant. Although these might seem like very different creatures, in fact, there are a lot of similarities between them. They're both mammals, they both live in groups, and the social bonds they form are extremely strong. For example, when a new elephant is born, the others in the group will all gather round to greet it. They also live for a long time, like humans, and their brains are very large, which means that there may be room for something in there that allows them to process some type of language. In the programme, Laura Martins, who has spent many years studying the communication systems of whales, describes how although whales do have very good sight, like humans they mostly use sound to communicate. In the case of whales, this is because this travels well in water, where visibility may be limited. In the programme, you'll hear underwater recordings of the whale calls, but what we don't know yet is whether the whales are talking to one another, or whether the sounds are just to allow them to identify one another. Also speaking on the programme is Dr. Jeff Burns, who has made a special study of elephant communication. Elephants use all their senses to communicate, but as Dr. Jeff Burns explains, one way we are only just beginning to find out about is what has been referred to as silent singing. sounds produced by elephants which are too low for humans to hear, but can be heard by other elephants. And did you know that another way in which elephants can hear is with their feet? So, when one elephant stamps on the ground, maybe to warn about danger, the sound travels through the ground, and another elephant up to 30 kilometers away may pick it up. To find out more about exactly how they do this, stay tuned to Radio 6 for Animal Talk.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
Listen to the whole survey in the correct order and answer the questions.
First, look at questions 11 to 14. Listen carefully.
Excuse me. Good morning. We're students from St. Anne's School and we're doing a class survey. Have you got 5 minutes to answer a few questions?
I suppose so. What are the questions about?
About spending habits, people's attitudes to money and what they spend money on.
Well, yes, OK, but only 5 minutes.
Thank you. OK, first of all, if you don't mind answering, what income band are you in?
You just need to say low, average or high.
Oh, that's difficult to say. I don't know how much everyone else makes. I'm certainly not poor, but I'm not rich either. Certainly not after I've paid all my bills.
Shall we say in the middle then?
Yes, I think so.
And how much money do you feel you have to spend? You said that you have to pay a lot of bills.
Yes, I feel that I don't have very much. I earn quite good money, but it doesn't feel like that most of the time. I guess everyone would like to have a bit more money, though.
OK, so what do you spend most of your money on?
Well, most of it goes on monthly expenses. I've got a big mortgage on my house, and my children's school fees are very high. After I've paid for gas and electricity and water, and all the insurance on the house and my car, I don't have much left. I like taking my wife out to a nice restaurant once a month, but I don't very often buy clothes. Oh, and I collect radios. Old radios. That's my hobby.
And how do you usually pay for the things you buy?
I use my debit card for most things these days. I have 2 credit cards, but I don't like using them. I prefer to pay for things immediately. Otherwise, I feel I'm getting into debt. I pay my bills online or over the telephone. I usually have between £10 and £20 in cash with me to pay for emergencies, taxi fares and that kind of thing.
Before the broadcast continues, look at questions 15 to 20. You will now listen to the second part of the talk.
What do you think is good value for money?
Not very much, to tell you the truth. Everything seems to cost more than it should these days. I think my telephone and internet broadband package is good value for money, though. That's my telephone line, any number of national calls and unlimited internet use for only £22 a month. I think at least one member of my family is online for an hour or more every day. I think £22 is a very good deal.
And what do you think is a waste of money?
Personally, I don't understand why anyone buys a new car. They are so expensive, and as soon as you drive them out of the showroom, they're worth £3,000 less. Perhaps I'm just saying it because I can't afford a new car myself. But to me, it seems so much more sensible to buy a good second-hand car for half the money.
Do you ever buy anything you can't afford?
Yes, I collect radios, old radios. I have 9 now, and they're quite expensive. I paid £350 for a 1950s radio last month. I didn't have much money for the rest of the month after that. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but it's important to treat yourself occasionally, don't you think? My wife buys nice perfume and lots of clothes, and I have my radios.
OK, so finally, would you say that you're a spender or a saver?
Well, as I said, I don't really have much to save, but I guess I'm a saver rather than a spender. It's good to enjoy money if you have it, but you must save for a rainy day. You never know what will happen in the future.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Have a nice day now.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3. Part 3.
You will hear a woman called Phoebe, who is training to be a teacher, talking to her tutor called Tony about research she has done in a school. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen and answer questions 21 to 25.
So, how did you get on with your school-based research, Phoebe?
Well, it was exhausting, but really valuable.
Good. What was the specific focus you chose?
My title is Attitudes Towards Study Among 11 to 12-year-old Pupils.
Right, and what made you choose that focus?
Well, that's a bit difficult. Lots of my classmates decided on their focus really early on, mainly on the basis of what they thought would help in their future career, in their first years teaching.
So that's what helped you decide?
Actually, it was that I came across a book written by experienced teachers on student attitudes, and that motivated me to go for the topic.
OK. So what were your research questions or issues?
Well, I wanted to look at the ways students responded to different teachers, particularly focusing on whether very strict teachers made teenagers less motivated.
And from your research, did you find that was true?
No, not from what I saw, from my 5 days observation, talking to people and so forth.
OK. We'll talk about the actual research methods in a moment, but before that, can you briefly summarise what your most striking findings are?
Well, what really amazed me was the significant gender differences. I didn't set out to focus on that, but I found that boys were much more positive about being at school. Girls were more impatient. They talked a lot about wanting to grow up and leave school.
Very interesting.
Yeah, it is. From doing the research, it was clear to me that you might start out to focus on one thing, but you pick up lots of unexpected insights.
Right. Did you get any insights into teaching?
Yes, certainly. I was doing a lot of observations of the way kids with very different abilities collaborate on certain tasks, help each other. And I began to realise that the lessons were developing in really unexpected ways.
So, what conclusion do you draw from that?
Well, I know it's necessary for teachers to prepare lessons carefully, but it's great if they also allow lessons to go their own ways.
Good point. Now, I'm really pleased to see you doing this. Analysing and drawing conclusions based on data.
But surely this isn't proper data.
Because it's derived from such small-scale research. Well, as long as you don't make grand claims for your findings, this data is entirely valid. I like the way you're already stepping back from the experience and thinking about what you've learned about research. Well done.
But I know I could have done it better.
As you become more experienced, you'll find ways to reduce the risk of difficulties.
Okay.
Now you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
So, let's look in more detail at how you gathered your data. Let's start with lesson observation.
Well, it generally went quite smoothly. I chose my focus and designed my checklist. Then teachers allowed me into their classes without any problems, which surprised me. It was afterwards that the grueling work started.
Yeah, it's very time-consuming, isn't it? Making sense of analysing your observation notes.
Absolutely. Much more so than interview data, for example. That was relatively easy to process, though I wanted to make sure I used a high-quality recorder to make transcription easier. And I had to wait until one became available.
Right. And did you interview some kids as well?
In the end, yes. I talked to 10, and they were great. I'd imagined I'd be bored listening to them, but...
So it was easy to concentrate?
Sure. One of the teachers was a bit worried about the ethics, whether it was right to interview young pupils, and it took a while for him to agree to let me talk to 3 of the kids in his class, but he relented in the end.
Good. What other methods did you use?
I experimented with questionnaires, but I really regret that now. I decided to share the work with another student, but we had such different agendas it ended up taking twice as long.
That's a shame. It might be worth you reflecting on ways you might improve on that for future projects.
You're right, yeah.
Okay.
And the other thing I did was stills photography. I didn't take as many pictures as I'd hoped to.
Lack of time?
It's pretty easy just snapping away, but I wanted each snap to have a purpose, that would contribute to my research aims, and I found that difficult.
Well, that's understandable, but remember...
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
In today's lecture on international trade, I'm going to look at the issue of protectionism. I'll start off with a definition of protectionism and then go on to look at the methods countries have used to protect their economy. Following this, I'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of protectionism when compared to free and open trade. So let's define protectionism. Protectionism, at its simplest, is the opposite of free trade. It is the practice of protecting domestic industries from foreign competition by using import duties or quotas. Options available to protect the economy are tariffs, embargoes, subsidies and quotas. Let's examine these in turn with some examples. Tariffs are one form of protectionism. It is a tax which is applied to imported goods, but not to home-produced goods. The idea is to make the imported goods more expensive than the home-produced ones, so that consumers buy home-produced items. An ongoing example of protectionism via tariff is between Britain and the USA. Britain buys most of its bananas from Commonwealth countries, largely in the Caribbean. However, the USA owns banana plantations in South America. In 1999, Britain refused to buy bananas from South America, so the US government put tariffs on some British-produced goods. The most famous example was a tariff of 100% import tax on wool products from Scotland brought into the United States. The next method of protectionism is embargoes. An embargo is a complete ban on the import of certain goods. For example, following the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s, the USA banned the import of Cuban cigars. Unfortunately, Cuban cigars are the finest in the world, and there is consequently a thriving black market in Cuban cigars in the USA. As we can see in the example, embargoes can lead to a black market, or unofficial economy, if people want the goods badly enough. Subsidies are a way governments support industries at home with money or tax breaks in order to allow them to compete better with foreign companies. In 1994, the French government provided its national airline with a £2 billion subsidy in order to help it compete with low-cost airlines. However, subsidies can have the effect of making home producers uncompetitive and inefficient. Finally, let's look at quotas. A quota system allows a certain quantity of goods to be imported from other countries. The European Union has had quotas on textiles and clothing for decades to protect its textile industries from developing countries, especially India and China. Understandably, developing countries say that this is unfair and against the principles of free trade. Let's move on now to the arguments for and against protectionism. For trade to flourish between countries, the benefits from trade need to be equally balanced. Where a country feels that it's not getting a fair share of the trade, or that it is somehow disadvantaged, it might employ one or more of the methods of protection. There are at least 4 arguments that may be given for using protectionism. Firstly, to protect employment in the home country. The simple view is that if imports are stopped, then jobs will be saved and even created at home. Secondly, to prevent unfair competition. It is often said that developing countries have the advantage of cheap labour costs in their countries, and that they use this to undercut the price of the same goods produced in richer nations. A tariff might be applied to even out this imbalance. Thirdly, to protect new industries. A new industry, particularly one in a developing country, might not be able to compete with long-established industries elsewhere. Tariffs and quotas give new industries the chance to build up production to the point where they can compete. Fourthly, to raise money. Tariffs were once used as a way of raising revenue for the government. In modern countries, they are now seldom used for this purpose, as the damage to trade often outweighs any immediate benefits. Now for the arguments against protectionism, which are perhaps simpler to summarise. Although trade restrictions might help a country for a short period of time, their overall effect is a negative one. Restrictions affect the flow of trade, and the more countries employ restrictions, the less trade can flow. In the long run, no one benefits from trade restriction, because if one country puts restrictions on another country, the other country then puts their own restrictions on the first country. This affects the first country's exports, and as the country finds it difficult to export goods, then unemployment is the result. So, protection tends to help only the protected and can hide inefficient manufacturers.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.